All right, thanks, Clay. We'll go ahead and dive right into it here. A little bit about me. Uh, I graduated from the Naval Academy in 2017 with a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Information Technology. Been in a lot of different seats over the years. I started working at the Defense Innovation Unit when it was experimental in 2017 in uniform, transitioned to a contractor role, transitioned to a DoD civilian role a little bit later. I came back to the contract role, and that's where I work today at Edgesource Corporation, where we are a recognized assessor for the Blue UAS program, which is now hosted. It was formerly the Defense Innovation Unit. It's now hosted by the DCMA, Defense Contract Management Agency. So a few awards and recognitions there on the bottom, as well as a photo there on the right from some of the previous things I've done. So what we're going to talk about today, a little bit about the Blue UAS process. We're going to start with a little bit of history, then we're going to dive into what the process looks like, some important policy bits. We'll talk at the end about some standards, and of course, I'll answer any of your questions at the end. So to just provide a bit of background and context on how we got to where we are today, on my screen, I've got a timeline. The far left of the timeline kind of shows the beginning of some of these bans or restrictions with respect to unmanned systems back in 2017 with the U.S. Army banning DJI specifically. That boiled up into a Department of Defense-wide ban on everything commercial off the shelf, COTS, in 2018. And from there, we've kind of progressed through this iterative phase, starting with DIU supporting the Army on the Short Range Reconnaissance Program in 2019. Of course, we have Section 848 of the FY20 National Defense Authorization Act. And moving forward, the Blue UAS initiative has kind of been around since about that 2019-2020 period. Blue UAS was essentially born out of the SRR program coupled with the NDAA restrictions and the STEP-SecDef ban on commercial off-the-shelf aircraft. Uh, there's been a few policy changes on the farther right side of this with respect to Section 817 and the American Security Drone Act. A lot of that information is available on the DCMA website with respect to what the policies are. More recently, in 2025, the Secretary of War released a few memorandums. There's also a couple executive orders, most importantly, EO 14307, focused on drone dominance. And some of you might know we are currently in the middle of Gauntlet 1 of drone dominance. So the first 25 vendors that were successful in being selected for that are currently out doing their Gauntlet 1 trials. So what does it mean, and why did EdgeSource really try to become a recognized assessor in this case? We've been around the block a bit. Personally, I've done a lot of different things over the years across the world as well as across the different entities within the United States, federal agencies, the Department of Defense, Department of War in these days, and a variety of other international entities as well. So when the opportunity came up in 2025 for some additional assessors to be selected and chosen. EdgeSource submitted our application to do that, and we ended up being selected. We love doing this kind of work. We love helping others do this kind of work and really understand the regulations and the policies. So our goal here is to try and make sure that everybody understands how things work, what the government's looking for in these assessments, what we're looking for as an assessor, as well as what things you can do to make that a little bit better. You can also see from reading the slide here, there's a lot of other places that I've played over the years, specifically in forensics and counter UAS, TTPs from foreign adversaries. All of these things are related to one another and kind of feed into the broader unmanned ecosystem as a whole. So we'll take a pause there before we dive into the actual briefing on some of the standards and policies to ask this quick poll. And Clay, if you wanted to go ahead and set the poll up here. But true or false, all components in an aircraft are reviewed for its overall NDAA compliance.
Dan, we're at about 50-50 right now.
Okay. 50-50.
Uh-huh.
All right. So the answer is false. Not everything is considered a critical component, but there are some complicators that have been changed recently with respect to the FCC that we'll get to at the end that can lead to some confusion there. So, an aircraft is broken down into the following eight critical components that I've got on the screen here. Anything that does not fall into one of these eight categories is not actually covered by the NDAA, and therefore its compliance is not critical at the moment. Now, that does not mean that the NDAA couldn't change in the future, and there's a potential that in 2026 or in 2027 we might see some of the important things that are missing on this list, like motors, added later. But for the moment, flight controller and radio, camera and gimbal are considered mostly the aircraft side component. Those ones are pretty obvious. A data transmission device is anything that is smart enough to actively transmit data on the aircraft. That tends to be a lot of electronic speed controllers that have that capability. Smart batteries, if there's communication coming from a battery pack, then it would be considered covered as well. But a standard LiPo battery pack, a 6S or 3S battery pack, is not going to fall on this list at the moment either. And then on the ground side, the overall ground control system is typically covered as well as any of the software that's running on it. So Q ground control or mission planner, whatever is being used, as well as the ins and outs of the components for the GCS as well. And finally, anything that supports any kind of network connectivity, that tends to be mostly stuff on the ground, but if there is network connectivity components that aren't just radios on the air side as well. So there's a few different items with respect to the list that I want to clear up just in case there's some confusion here. So there's the Blue UAS framework, and then there's the cleared list, and there's Blue UAS select. The framework is for components. So these are individual critical components. Think a specific radio, a specific NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano, for example. There's a list of these components on the DCMA Blue List website. If your aircraft uses these components, it makes the assessment of the aircraft as a whole a little bit easier. The same approval process and standard applies to the components. Some of the items may not be applicable. There's a few standard items such as radio encryption that aren't applicable to, say, a flight controller by itself. That would be more specific to the radios. Nonetheless, if you use framework components in your aircraft, it speeds up the process for any sort of Blue UAS cleared assessment. The cleared list is the aircraft or the devices themselves. Those that end up being determined to be compliant go onto the clear list. They do require specific entries with respect to hardware. BOM changes can change the Blue UAS cleared list evaluation. So any sort of BOM change has to be communicated with the Blue Management Agency, which is DCMA, and that can be either through a recognized assessor or directly with them once a device has been cleared. And select is a higher level. Uh, if you go through something like drone dominance, you may end up on something like select. You may get a full authority to operate from the government at that point in time. Most things tend to fall on the cleared list. So generally, the steps to get onto the list this year haven't changed much from previously. So there's a checklist on the DCMA website that you fill out with a lot of information about your aircraft. That's a bill of materials, a bill of lading, some details on the specifications and overview, some imagery, etc. That takes about a week or so for that to be processed. So what really happens there is you go through this checklist and you can choose if you have a specific recognized assessor that you'd like to assess your platform. You can choose that individual, or you can have DCMA send the application to all six of the assessors. You'll receive back a series of quotes, either from just the assessor that you specified or from all six. It'll be between you and the various assessors to decide which one you would like to move forward with in contracting. And again, that process takes about a week for you to get to the phase where you would have the quotes back from DCMA and be able to go through with contracting on one of the specific assessors. At that point in time, then the assessor will perform the actual compliance verification of your aircraft or component. The timeline for that can vary widely. It'll typically fall in the 1 to 3 week range, but depends on the size of the aircraft or the complexity of the device, how many components are already blue listed, if any, and so on. Also, shipping time, of course, falls in between these two in order for getting the devices physically to the assessor. And if there's any sort of supply chain holdups or anything along those lines, that'll of course impact these timelines. Once the assessment is complete, the RA will submit that report back to the Blue UAS organization. Again, that's currently DCMA. They will review that and make their final approval determination. If there are any mitigations that were recommended or remediation steps that were recommended during the evaluation, they'll review those and make sure that they concur. The assessors are just going to provide a detailed document to the government as well as a recommendation to the government that they either approve or do not approve or approve with conditions. So the government will then go through and review the full report and either concur with that decision or they'll come back and ask questions. So that process can take a lot longer than a week, depending on what the government's timeline and schedule looks like. With drone dominance ongoing right now, I would expect this timeline to be extended while the focus is on what's going on with respect to Gauntlet 1. But nonetheless, that's a general overview of the timeline and the process for getting this done. In terms of the actual assessment, so that middle block, if we dive a little bit into that middle block, the one thing you can do before you start the process is engage any of the recognized assessors, and we are included in that for any sort of discussion or overview to understand, hey, am I actually ready to do this? Are there components? You can buy a lot of things on the internet that say they're NDAA compliant. You'll find all sorts of NDAA compliant things offered out there, whether you're looking for a radio module or a flight controller. There's a lot of things that are listed as NDAA compliant. Not all of those are actually approved Blue UAS framework components. And the difference there is an NDAA compliant statement is essentially a self-assertion of compliance, and it may or may not be accurate. Whereas devices that are on the Blue UAS framework have been approved and already vetted by the US government and are accepted in their format, so long as the format hasn't changed. So this is where people get tripped up a lot. So a lot of the assessors can help understand what that looks like. Is there going to be a problem with this particular component I've chosen? Can you recommend perhaps what should I do? I'm looking to use an NVIDIA board. What boards should I look into using, et cetera, et cetera. So depending on where you are in your aircraft development timeline and pipeline, you can always engage an assessor to ensure that you're starting from the appropriate assumptions as you kind of build your product forward. Once you actually submit the information through to the Blue UAS portal, what we do as an assessor is we will set up a kickoff call with you and your company where we'll go through and make sure that we have all of the information that we need, as well as give you any shipping instructions for what devices we need. We need a ground control station or we need an aircraft. If there's ways for us to get those already disassembled or fully functional, we'll need both at the end of the day. But depending on supply chain things, we'll work all of that out on an after contract call with you to make sure that we understand any gaps or things from the outset. The other thing we'll be doing sort of concurrently is the NDAA side of the company ownership and foreign ownership and control. So we'll have to do some overview reviews of who owns the company. When you do the Blue UAS checklist, you'll have to submit a cap table, a capitalization table with a 10% threshold. We'll review all of that and look for any ownership that's going to be problematic with respect to what's stated in the NDAA. The next thing we'll do after that, of course, is software, firmware analysis, any sort of cybersecurity components, and we'll talk a little bit in the next few slides about what some of those standard items look like and the standards available for those that attended the webinar. We can send the document directly that the government has the assessors assessed to with respect to the standard. We'll work with you to make this as easy and quick as possible, and we'll do the cybersecurity testing. And finally, hardware analysis. We'll do a teardown of the platform, looking for components or items that are not going to be considered acceptable for the NDAA. And finally, we'll pull together a final report. In that final report, this is where we can address any deficiencies that we find. So we do have the ability, to, as I said in the process, to provide a remediation or a mitigation strategy in the final report. We will discuss that with you before we issue our final report. If, for example, there's an STM32 that we find that's been sourced from a covered foreign country, we might be able to recommend remediation by providing or looking for specific fabs or specific factories where those are manufactured at. And we can work with you to provide that remediation in the report. And that way, as the government's reviewing, they can see that the company or the vendor is already sort of taking steps towards correcting this. We found a deficiency. At the end of the day, DCMA, the RAs, everybody's working together to try to get as many people on the list as possible. So we're trying to remove as much of the uncertainty and challenge as possible, but we still, unfortunately, cannot change what the NDAA states. So if you have a component that's not going to pass the NDAA, that's not something that can be waived, but we can find ways to mitigate that by addressing the supply chain or providing ways to change the component. And of course, there would be follow-on checks and validations before that can take place. And on that, Clay, we can go to our next question here. All Blue UAS must be manufactured in the United States. Is that true or is that false?
All right, Dan, we have a strong consensus on false.
Okay, that would be correct. Now, again, the FCC changes of late, I'll talk about those in a few slides, will add a different aspect to this that is important to keep in mind. But yes, Blue UAS can be manufactured in any non-covered country. The process, however, to do so looks a little bit different depending upon what country you're from. So we have Group A, which is platforms, components, and software from a United States-based company, and Group B, anything that's not United States. And you can see a lot more detail on what these two groupings are by going to the Blue List website, and there's some flow diagrams and charts on there for those two. Generally, Group A is a little bit easier. The process tends to be a little bit quicker and faster if you are based in the United States, or if the manufacturing of the aircraft is in the United States. For everything else, the process is still achievable, but there's a few additional steps. Diving in on the Group A side of the house, Option A is really for if you need to speed something up or if you're looking for the government to assist in covering the bill for this, you can have a U.S. military nomination. So an O6 could nominate the product, and then there's a verification for an O7 or an SES. So an O6 is a colonel or above in the military, and an O7 is then a flag officer or a general officer. So I think any kind of general or admiral. Those may or may not end up going back down to the recognized assessors for review, and or some of these agencies may have their own sort of reviewing body. That's really the U.S. military option. The second option is if you don't have that kind of access, you don't have an O6 or an O7 plus that you can reach out to sponsor your product, you can always self-fund the process. The door is open to anybody at any given point in time, so long as you meet the general criteria to be a Blue UAS or a Blue UAS component. You can go on and fill out the framework. You can self-fund the assessment through any of the recognized assessors, and at the end of the day, that will get you through to the Blue List if you're successful, and you won't need any sort of other military member to help sponsor doing that. The same is true for Group B. There's essentially an option A and an option B. The option A is for those that have an agency. You can see that this is a little bit more restricted, so there's an empowered agency here. So it has to be one of these 7 or 6 entities. And if you split out the military departments, you'll have the Marine Corps and Navy and such. You still have the self-funded assessment. So this is where most companies end up going through is the self-funded assessment. But for example, drone dominance as a program is an example of an option A in both Group A and Group B, where the government is doing the assessment as a part of Gauntlet 1. So all the companies are participating in both the Gauntlet, but they're also doing their assessments during the event. The assessments are going on the side for those products. So a little bit on some of these changes that I've mentioned a couple times now with respect to the FCC. So you may have seen in late December that the FCC updates its covered list to include foreign UAS and UAS critical components. If you read through this notice, you'll note that the definition of what's covered is different for the FCC than it is for the NDAA. Also, the definition of what a foreign UAS is different than what's in the NDAA. The NDAA uses language such as covered foreign companies, whereas the FCC uses broader language, which is all foreign UAS companies. So that's anything that's not the United States. Same thing is true for the critical components. The critical components definition includes motors and batteries and other components for the FCC as well. So if you have a product that requires an FCC approval in order to operate, most radios or an aircraft that uses a radio or something to that effect, you will have to get a waiver from either the Department of War or the Department of Homeland Security, and there's a waiver process posted on the FCC website. Or if you achieve Blue List certification, that waiver is automatically applied. So anything that's already on the Blue List is immediately waived and no longer considered on the covered list. This also only applies to new products, so it's not retroactive. If there's already a FCC authorization or grant associated with a product, those did not get invalidated. Those are still there. This is just for any new product that is going to require an authorization going forward. For the moment, this is only added through January of 2027. However, I would expect in the next few months to hear an update either from DCMA or the FCC on what this is going to look like going forward. Everything else with respect to what DIU's policies, procedures, and standards were before this transition to DCMA have remained unchanged. The standard is the same as it was. The procedure and the process is the same as it was. DCMA has built a new website that I've linked on the previous slide. That website has all the details of what the covered list is. You'll notice some things on there for the future of unmanned surface vehicles, ground vehicles, subsurface vehicles, things like that. Those aren't fully announced yet in terms of the website just has some links for these additional cleared list items, but the details of what that looks like is not fully announced just yet. And motors and batteries. This question is a pretty common one I get all the time. At the moment, per the NDAA, motors and batteries are still not covered. So regardless of what the FCC's regulations are, the NDAA still doesn't cover motors and batteries unless they fall into that data transmission device category we discussed earlier. Most motors don't. Only smart batteries that have some sort of battery management system or specialized smart controller or something then fall under that other category. All right. A little bit about the standard itself. So if you're going through this assessment, there's 8 different categories of things that an assessor will be looking for with respect to your product. And again, the standard is the same whether it's a component or an aircraft. Each of these will have to be reviewed. The assessor will be able to mention whether or not something is not applicable, and they'll justify that to the government. So our report will include answers to, and there's a couple subtopics, so you'll be able to see if you receive the full standard copy, what some of the subcomponents are for each of these. But these are the overviews here. The first is just compliance verification. That's making sure that the device follows with the NDAA compliance requirements. And then 2 through 7 are cybersecurity focused. So the big focus is protection of sensitive data. Most of these other things have some sort of tangent to protection of sensitive data. At the end of the day, the end goal is for the aircraft to be secure, and that any data that's on board the platform is protected, either with some type of encryption or it's not stored at all. We look at the actual config management process, version control, and update process specifically so that software revisions can be applied later without having to go through the Blue process again and again and again. So we will try to look through your actual pipeline. How are you building and adding new features? And how do you check, most importantly, for the security of new things? Are you doing any sort of container scanning if you have containers? Are you doing any sort of security scanning before you release a final version? And finally, the update process. Uh, the update process, as well as that there's a secure update mechanism available. How do you get firmware to your clients? How do those clients ensure that the firmware that they've received from you is actually legitimate? That could be just signing, code signing, or something like that. It could be a secure portal that you have on your website for access to firmware, etc. The last three focus on some of the ground control station side of the house items. If there are bits and pieces of data that need to be collected, whether it's for some sort of AI feature or some backend server capability that you have, is there an option for a user to operate the aircraft with those turned off? Is there an offline mode? Is there a way to turn off collection of certain potentially sensitive data, such as an email address or a phone number, or is that data required and mandatory? And around locations as well, where's the aircraft being operated at? Is there ways to prevent that data from going back from the platform back to some server that's not in the control of the operator themselves? And of course, if it does, what does the where does that server reside becomes an important consideration on the compliance side. If data does go to servers, it's likely to need to be in GovCloud or someplace that can be confirmed to be inside of the United States or a non-covered country. Okay. And finally, the Section 8 is really about what the recognized assessor is doing. This is just kind of the standard line item for what the assessor reports, as well as include the different body of evidence items that we'll have to submit back to the government, such as images of the teardown to demonstrate the NDAA compliance or non-compliance if that's the case, user manuals, operator manuals, guidelines, policies, any of the documentation that we reviewed and looked at to make our determination for each of the other categories would then be submitted along with a report. And finally, this is where we can throw in mitigation strategies, remediation options, things that we've discussed. We'll usually, as our policy as a recognized assessor, would be to brief you on our findings before we submit the final report to the government. And that way we can make certain that our findings are accurate. If there is a remediation or if we were shipped the incorrect component, for example, that gets documented in the report. But we would note as a mitigation, for example, that let's say you have two versions of a flight controller. One's a NDAA compliant version and one is not. And you accidentally shipped us the non-compliant version initially and didn't realize it. It's easy to do. We would still document that that took place in the report, but we would note that we've discussed that that happened with you all, and we'd go through a remediation procedure to help ensure that that doesn't happen to a real customer for the Blue UAS going forward. That's just an example. So we would work with the different suppliers to help you guys get to something that will be accepted by DCMA. Once we submit our report to DCMA, there may be some back and forth between the government and us and yourselves for them to understand any areas that they need clarification on. And then, of course, the government will make their final determination. So really, to kind of cap it all off at the end of the day, the more prepared, the more you understand, and the more you know as you go into this process, the better suited you are to work your way through it, especially if you're new to this, if you're not familiar with all these different terms or different things that we have, definitely try to reach out to a recognized assessor ahead of time. We can help. We can help make sure that your platform is as best positioned for the process as possible. That way, once you do submit to the portal officially, that the process can be pretty easy and streamlined, and you can get through the assessment without having to do a lot of these remediations and things in process, and it just makes it a little bit easier to ensure success, and also will speed the process up significantly. And with that, Clay, I will pass it over for if we have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Everyone, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. You can use that to type in any questions. We'll give everybody a minute. Okay, a couple of questions here. I'll start summarizing them for you, Dan. First one is
Okay.
just talk a little bit more about the difference between platforms and components. And if I've got a whole bunch of components already, can I turn that into a platform faster?
Yes. Okay. I can talk a little bit more about that. So yes, the components are those individual bits, the flight controller. So if you were to submit to me an aircraft for a Blue UAS assessment, it may have or it'll have all of the major things an aircraft might have, right? So we'll have a flight controller, my electronic speed controller. Maybe it'll assume that there's a smart battery just for this example. Radios, an onboard companion computer, perhaps. Maybe that's where your NVIDIA comes in. That aircraft during its assessment will have to be assessed for all of those components, each component that's not already listed. So for all of the ones that are already listed, it kind of speeds that process along pretty significantly, as a matter of fact. So uh, theoretically, if you took a carbon fiber frame, for example, and you went down the blue list and used only already existing framework components and put them all together on your platform, if you're in Group A, if you're a United States-based company, it's pretty strongly likely that when you submit through the Blue UAS portal, that the government would look at that and say, "Well, we're going to blue list this because everything's already blue on the platform." If you're from Group B, the government's very likely to send it through a recognized assessor still to look for if there was any implementation issues in terms of putting those bits and pieces together. Um, that's mostly at the government's determination on whether they feel the platform is going to need an additional analysis or not. So depending on whichever group you're from, even if you use all blue components, there's still the aspect of you put everything together, but how did you configure the radio? How did you configure the flight controller? Are you using all of the different security features that are available? Depending on what the government reviews in your manuals and documentation, they may or may not request you to go through an assessor still or not. But at the end of the day, yes, using framework components, even if the government still requests a full assessment, the assessors are still going to be able to say on their report, the flight controller was a blue listed component, the companion computer is blue listed, and the radio was something that was blue listed. And so they won't have to dive so deep into that component. They won't have to do a full teardown of that component. They'll just need to do the cybersecurity part of making sure that the things that were put together, that the communications in between those components and the connections and everything are still secure. And that can speed up the process significantly, especially if many of the components on the platform are already on the blue list. Back to you, Clay. For
And, and the related sort of other side of the coin for that question is if there's components, even third-party components in my platform that I submit and I get the platform through, do those components become blue listed as well?
That's correct. Yes. So all of the components that are used in a platform will end up on the framework, and the platform will end up on the cleared list. So yes, if there are third-party components that have already been that have not already been assessed but are being submitted, they will also end up on the framework as well. Of course, assuming that those components are past the certification as well. Some
Uh,
I'll just add some color to that at the end
yeah,
here, Clay. Sometimes the component manufacturer will come to the blue list directly and submit just their component. And so there's been some examples of that. So if you there's a lot of the really common and more popular suppliers like CubePilot or uh, Arc Electronics will submit a lot of the different components they have through the list organically to make it easier for their customers to choose those items. Whereas sometimes the aircraft will come through and there'll be something proprietary, for example. Uh, Not every, a lot of times, some aircraft will use a non-proprietary bit and piece over here, but they won't have the entire aircraft made out of framework components for one reason or another. So it's kind of set up to offer pathways for both of those, and hopefully try to make it as easy as possible for people to get through the process.
brilliant. Related question to that, does changing a component lead to a whole new assessment?
Well, the answer
of
to
a
that
platform?
is yeah, it can. It doesn't require it, but it can. It really depends on the government's view of the complexity of the change and whether or not the component is, depending on how critical the component is. And I say how critical, not in a sense of being covered by the NDAA, but a flight controller, for example, or a radio that has a significant impact on the cybersecurity assessment component as well, could very much so require a reassessment. But if you were changing out uh, maybe a camera, the the likelihood is that they would just have the new component assessed by itself. The new payload may be assessed by itself, and then if the rest of the aircraft remains the same and you just have two or three different payloads, then you would have the aircraft cleared, and then the payloads would each be cleared independently. So if you added a fourth payload later, you would just have to redo that payload. But again, it depends on the complexity of the change. And similar similar thread to that on the software side, I addressed it earlier. Software and firmware changes tend to be accepted through the validation of the verification process, the security process before release, and the secure update mechanisms. Um, but sometimes those things really, once you're on the blue list, you'll have a POC option either through your RA or through DCMA to submit some change like that through, and they can take a look at it. And each one tends to be sort of a case by case based on what's happening. But that's kind of the most common sort of option for those types of things.
And one more question that's sort of component related about things that aren't showing up on the list right now, specifically networking components like Ethernet switches. How do those play into this story?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they're still going to be considered a critical component. I think you'll probably see over the next few months as DCMA starts to sort of adapt the process a little bit more. You might see new types of components showing up. There's a significant number of critical components that aren't currently. When you go onto the framework site and you look at the types of components, there's not everything on there, like was mentioned, Ethernet switches. Um, some things may just be bucketed under data transmission device or networking device. That's a possibility. Uh, the other the other thing you might find is there may be remote ID devices in the near future. Batteries aren't currently on there, but there are some entities that are looking to have batteries, especially if they're smart, already assessed. You might still see something like that start to be categorized under data transmission or whatever the main NDAA category is for it. But I would expect in the next, as DCMA continues to evolve their website, the experience you see with that table might change, and those component names might change around to be a little bit more specific for what the actual purposes of the device and why it's covered or under what it falls. Or there are some folks that have looked to get their things assessed, specifically motors or batteries, simply to have it done before the NDAA changes in anticipation of an NDAA alteration in the future that might add those components to the critical component list. So you might see something like that start to show up as well. Um, but that's kind of on the DCMA end for the moment.
All right. Um, Next question. This is, I think, going back a little bit more to your discussion in the final slide. What are some really specific sort of actionable steps that people can take to reduce their risk before they start an assessment, get
Right.
the get ready process?
Yes, the get ready process. The best thing that you can do is try to understand the process as best as you can. So attending a webinar like this and asking this question is a really good start. Reaching out to a recognized assessor to have a conversation to have more specific questions you have about your platform addressed. A lot of the assessors will offer some sort of service to do a teardown for you ahead of time. You could choose an assessor for that. You could choose a third party for that. So you could do if depending on where your uncertainty falls in the list of potential areas that you might not pass the assessment, or you might feel that you're not going to pass the assessment. If it's all of them, then I'd certainly say going through a mock assessment with an assessor would be a good idea, and they can kind of do an evaluation for you and look at your platform ahead of time, and give you a good sense of where there may be deficiencies. If you feel really confident about some components, but you're unsure about others, then you can always reach out with those direct questions. If there's gray areas that you're just unsure about, those are good ones to send to the RAs. We can kind of feed that back up through DCMA, and either get an authoritative answer from the government on it, or an update to the DCMA website if something's not written in a clear manner. The RAs do weekly syncs with DCMA, where we can surface feedback like that if there's significant confusion for the way things are presented. Um, and finally, following general cybersecurity best practice, that uh, that kind of hygiene and thing goes a long way with respect to whether or not your platform will be considered uh, trustworthy at the end of the day. So, some small deficiencies throughout the aircraft, some things that you might be missing because you're working on it. Maybe code signing is a little bit difficult to implement, and you're working on it. You have a plan for it, but you're not quite there yet. Some of those things you can probably work through the blue list ahead of time on, and the government will be understanding of the fact that you're working on it, depending on how strong the rest of your posture is as a company. So it's not as it's there's a lot of sort of flexibility with respect to how things get assessed. And at the end of the day, it's a sort of if you've ever done a security clearance in the past, the whole of person concept. It's really a whole of product, whole of company assessment, where mitigating factors that are, positive in other places can impact and sort of influence some of the negative things as well. The standard is there to give a guideline for what the government is really hoping everybody will work towards, and you'll probably see updates in the future to the standard to add new things that the government is looking for. But at the end of the day, there's still some flexibility with respect to if there are significant challenges. For example, like I said, maybe implementing radio encryption is difficult for you, and you just haven't been able to get it yet. That's a specific item on the list. That's something the government would maybe try to work with you on, or an assessor could work with you on that as well, where you might be able to find an assessor that's capable of advising you technically with respect to how you can do that. Some of the assessors offer that option as well. And while most won't be able to actually do hands-on keyboard development for you, they can certainly help point you in the right direction if there's suppliers that are potentially problematic, or there's suppliers that could be really helpful to you. The assessors can certainly help there as well.
Brilliant. I think a related question to that, specifically about microcontrollers, like how important are they? And especially if their manufacturing location is really dependent on how they're monitored and verified through the whole process. Like, talk a little bit more about microcontrollers, please.
Yes. Generally, once you're inside of a critical component, so let's say a flight controller, for example, right? A lot of flight controllers are based on an STM32 H or F7 or something along those lines. Those those microcontrollers play a big part in whether or not the overall flight controller is considered acceptable. So the country of origin analysis will go down to that level within the critical components. So it doesn't just stop at the top level. The Cube pilot is manufactured in Taiwan by an Australian-owned company, so therefore it's NDAA compliant. That's a big piece of it, but it will go a layer deeper than as well, right? It's manufactured in Taiwan with STM32s that are sourced from an appropriate location. And so a lot of things that tend to happen, or that I tend to observe, is you'll see different suppliers will have a separate item or a separate SKU that's for specifically those NDAA compliant items. So you'll notice there's a Cube Blue to focus on the Blue UAS. Some of the other Cube components are blue listed, but there's a specific Q Blue as well. And that's one of those things that you can do, whether it's as an aircraft or as a component, to ensure sourcing. It depends on the microcontroller side, or on the even on the NVIDIA side, depending on what type of platform you're getting. There are different ways to get supply from a specific origin. I know NVIDIA has set up origin specific SKUs for certain ones of their modules. I'm not sure if STM has those or not. Um, Generally, that's kind of where that tends to fall. The STM32 is one of the common ones that we see. So it really comes down to working with a distributor or working with a supplier to ensure that the STM32s you're receiving are sourced from and stamped with Taiwan or Malaysia, or something that's not China, which would be a covered country then. Um, I know I'm using one example. There's certainly rabbit holes here. There's a lot of research and things. Generally, the chip itself, we're looking for, if you have an MCU that's, for example, not obviously labeled where its origin comes from. If all else fails, we'll try to go back to the headquarters of the company, that the ownership of the company that's doing the manufacturing, which we'll usually be able to find. So you might have something like Atmel or Microchip or something along those lines, but they didn't actually put an origin code or an assembly factory code or a wafer fab code on the component. So in those cases, we'll do a check and understand what information is available from that microcontroller provider. Some are a little bit more open about where things are sourced from, and some aren't. It just depends on where things fall. And then the other thing we'll look to is history. So what things have been accepted on the blue list already. So sometimes when in doubt, that that will uh, that will make something a little bit. There may be a slight potential that component is manufactured in a covered foreign country. There may be 5 or 10 different fabs that are producing that same component, and there's no real way to trace it down without going back to specific lot codes or something like that. It just depends on the component itself at that point in time. But MCUs do tend to be a important, given their prominence and the importance of the MCU, of course, a little bit more focus would be placed on an MCU over other supportive components like a voltage reg or a PMIC. Those types of components are going to be there's a lot less scrutiny on those ones. The microcontroller side of the house, there's definitely a lot more focus on that. Um, Given the fact that they're really actually handling the data a lot more than some of the other voltage or more electrical only type components are. But nonetheless, nearly everything is still on that list, right? So we're looking for most components that are dealing actively with data or the movement of data on the platform. So that's going to exclude your general passives. So of course, capacitors, inductors, and resistors, transistors, those types of things are generally going to be um, not really evaluated. Some of the middle ground components, like a voltage reg, will tend to pull those out and show where they come from. But it's really up to the government to determine at the end of the day whether or not the specific component with its specific placement and exactly how it's used in operation is going to be considered something that's going to result in an NDAA compliance issue. But really, it's mostly the MCUs that tend to lead to that, more so than the smaller, less impactful. Well, MCUs or RF chips, or any sort of cryptography chip, anything along those lines, those are all going to fall into that more critical, more uh, more sort of controlled category. What else we got, Clay?
All right. One more deep dive into a component.
Okay.
So for things like really simple analog sensors, like a voltage sensor or something like that, is that a data transmission device?
Uh, Not necessarily, no. So the data transmission device kind of follows, specifically, that kind of leads up to, that's the major critical component of the aircraft, right? So Uh, if I was looking at an electronic speed controller, for example, they've mostly been treated as data transmission devices, given many of them have the ability to send feedback to a flight controller or telemetry information and output. That does qualify them for a data transmission device. Some of the lower level sensors, not so much. Uh, an IR sensor might be considered a camera potentially, but generally, uh, no, those types of devices aren't. They're really looking for, especially on data transmission device, at least at the moment, really looking for things that are, especially at the top level critical component category. It's really that catch-all for any other component on the aircraft that might be, think of like a GPS, for example. A GPS module would be considered a data transmission device, an ADS-B module, a remote ID module. Some of those might fall into the radio category, some may not, depending on if they're actively transmitting, but they would fall under data transmission because they are capturing and collecting that kind of information and data. Um, Anything that can fall into the camera category, any sensors that are very camera-like, would also fall under the camera category, of course. But it does get to be a bit case by case and specific based on what exact components are used, specifically where and in what context.
All right, we got time for one more. Saving this one for last. Can you talk a little bit about how much a company should budget for this process, especially if they think it's
Mhm.
NDA compliant already? Like just ballpark, general level of complexity, all that.
Yep. Uh, yeah, and I'll give big ballparks again, just given the fact that it's very device specific. Generally, if you're looking at just a single component, you're probably looking in the $9,000 to $15,000 range. And if you are looking at a full aircraft with multiple components on it, probably somewhere in the mid 20s to, depending on complexity, all the way up to the mid 60s. So 25,000 or so up to 65,000, somewhere in that ballpark. Again, each Blue UAS portal submission will receive a set of quotes from the different RAs based on the information that you submit. So the number of Blue UAS components that are included in the aircraft, the potential complexity, how much of the aircraft would potentially need to be torn down with the hardware analysis, what's the footprint and complexity with respect to a cybersecurity analysis of the aircraft. And of course, you have a sort of baseline cost of just doing the assessment and reporting and all that as well. Um, those are the two ballparks I would give for you on that. But again, it's going to be wildly dependent on those, as well as how easy it is to maneuver around your aircraft, right? If you've got a small FPV, it's a lot easier to work with something like that than it might be if you've got something the size of a football field, just to use very exaggerated examples. So size will play into it, but each of the RAs is different, so the pricing will be different for everybody, and it's kind of unique to the specific platform that's being assessed, and of course, how many components are already blue listed.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dan. Um, Last thing always to everyone on the call is we get to ask you a question now. Last poll is actually free response. What else do you guys want to know about in the future? What will be the next webinar topic that would really interest you? I'll give you guys a few minutes. I wish I had the Jeopardy music to play. And then we will conclude for today. About 1 more minute for everyone to finish typing. Thanks to everyone who submitted. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Dan, for the presentation. Everyone can find us on the web at edgesource.com. You can find Dan on LinkedIn and send us any more questions or comments or thoughts you've got, and we will do our best to help you out.
Yep.
All
Thank you
right.
so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.